Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on management for high-quality organic wheat and ancient grain production in the Northeast. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our three presenters today. David Bencher is a research support specialist in the Small Grains Breeding Program in the Department of Plant Breeding and Genetics at Cornell University. For the past 16 years, he's been managing variety trials for spring and fall planted grains under conventional practices, but most recently he's been trialing heritage wheat and ancient grains under organic practices. Greg Roth is a professor of agronomy at Penn State University, where he works on grain crops research and extension, and he focuses on the management of grain crops like corn, wheat, barley, and soybeans to improve the yield, quality, and value in the marketplace. Elizabeth Dick is the coordinator of the Organic Growers Research and Information Sharing Network, otherwise known as OGRIN. She has conducted research in organic cropping systems for over 20 years through on-farm trials with growers. Her current research includes work with modern and heritage wheat and ancient grains. So now I'll be turning the screen control over to our first speaker, Greg.
And I just wanted to let everyone know that this presentation is supported through a project that we recently got funded. I guess it's been a year or so ago. It's a USDA NIFA OREI project entitled Value-Added Grains for Local and Regional Food Systems. And it's actually a collaboration of a number of different partners, Cornell University, and including me at Penn State, OGRIN, NOFA New York, PASA, the Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society, Green Market up in New York City, Oregon State, and North Dakota State University. And we also work in concert with a lot of farmers and bakers in the Northeast, who provide us some good feedback on our program objectives. So we're pleased to try to share some of our knowledge and experience base that we've collected through part of this project and some of the work we've done prior to this in our careers. And specifically in the project, we have a number of objectives to evaluate germplasm of these high market value grains, like heritage wheat, emmer, spelt, and einkorn, and then to try to develop some management recommendations. There's not a lot of management recommendations for some of these crops, and then to try to optimize grain quality through identifying these management techniques in the field and also post-harvest, and then to try to document a variety of approaches to dehulling and milling, which is critical, especially with some of these ancient grains. And then also investigate some strategies for accessing regional markets through active learning events with growers and bakers around our region. In today's presentation, we're going to focus on a couple of these objectives, in particular developing management recommendations and optimizing grain quality through identifying some of these management techniques. And a few of the things we're going to try to cover today in our webinar includes some of the basic wheat quality issues that detract from the grain quality of wheat and other grains that we'll be discussing, and some of the critical grain quality parameters and testing resources that we've found, and then a variety of management tactics for high-quality wheat and some of the ancient grains. And some of these we're still working on in our project. So we don't have the definitive answer, but we have some initial recommendations that we can share. And there's a number of things we'll try to touch on in 45 minutes here, including sourcing seed, crop rotation, fertility management, field preparation, planting dates and rates, weed management, harvesting, seed cleaning, and storage. So we have a lot of topics we're going to try to cover with you, and as Alice mentioned, there'll be opportunity for
unmuted
afterwards. and we're going to each split up and take some different parts of these topics. My colleague Elizabeth Dick is going to start us off with some of the common grain quality issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and she can talk to you a little bit about a few of the next topics.
Yeah, so we just wanted to start with an overview of some of the common grain quality issues we hear about from buyers and sellers. Low protein, this is about red wheat. So for example, for hard red spring wheat and hard red winter wheat can be an issue in our area. Off flavors in wheat can really destroy the wheat's saleability in milling and baking markets. Stones, moldy grain, sprouting in the head or low falling number, insect damage, disease seed. These are the major quality issues our growers and sellers are usually facing. And in most cases, these can have multiple causes, but also in most cases, good management can avoid or minimize these issues. So we want to spend the bulk of the presentation talking about some management techniques that can avoid these problems. So we thought we'd just start by talking about some quality parameters that our millers and bakers require. In terms of protein content, again, specifically for red wheat, hard red spring wheat, hard red winter wheat, they're usually talking about a protein range somewhere between 11.5 and 12.5%. That's what they like to see. Of course, they always like those higher protein numbers. In terms of falling number, which is a measure of sprouting damage in the grain, a falling number of less than 200 seconds, especially in bread quality wheat, is not good. It produces poor quality products, bread with poor texture, mushy pasta, sticky dough. So they really, these folks really like to see a falling number above 300. That's a good or appropriate falling number. In terms of vomitoxin, that's a very critical issue. It's also known as dioxynivalenol, or DON. This is a mycotoxin that can be produced in grain if the fungus fusarium is present. And for milling and baking standards, it's a very tough standard, less than 1 parts per million in the finished product. And buyers will require, at minimum, results of a vomitoxin test, but usually all 3 of these. But the grain quality parameters change if you're looking at other markets. So for example, malters have a slightly different set of criteria. I talked with Andrea Stanley of Valley Malt, and she suggested, for example, that she prefers a lower protein content in her grain, between 9 and 11%. She's more concerned about a high germination because, of course, malting involves sprouting the grain. Her same falling number as for milling, but plump kernels are particularly important. Now, in terms of vomitoxin, because the malting process can destroy some vomitoxin, you may find that there's a higher threshold for a cutoff on vomitoxin. You need to discuss this with your purchaser. Distilling, again, even lower protein is desirable, and again, the distilling process can destroy vomitoxin. So you may find that some grain that is not suitable for milling and baking may be possible to market for the distilling market. I just wanted you to see, this is a typical grain test result I get from a testing lab. I usually send out samples from a lot of farmers, and you can see this is for the 2012 season. In this particular season, because we had very warm weather and low moisture conditions, most of these are spring grains here, had quite high protein for our region. Very good falling numbers, maybe a little too high, but notice the range in vomitoxins, one of the samples of which exceeded that milling baking standard. So it's really important to test for that. I just wanted to give you some idea of the costs that this testing incurs. This lab that you're seeing here has pretty cheap prices. Its protein test, for example, is $3 a sample. Falling number, $10 a sample. Vomitoxin, $28 a sample. Vomitoxin will always be the most expensive test, but it's really vital. So just to sort of wrap these things up, we really urge growers to do grain quality testing. Test for vomitoxin, protein, and falling number at the very least. Be sure you collect a representative sample. It doesn't work to just take of one bag or one container. Make sure it's representative. And then I suggest you send it to a third-party lab rather than having it tested at a mill. This is so you'll get certified results that you can then share with many potential buyers. We're lucky that the University of Vermont has a cereal grain testing lab in our area, so you can check that out. Otherwise, you can go to the USDA website I've listed here to get a further listing of labs. And if you need more help, don't hesitate to email me at Obrin. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about sourcing and growing high-quality seed. I'll start first by talking about certified seed and the chance of double certification, and something else about variety selection, appropriate selection for your area. Let's see if that goes. There we go. I had the same problem as you, Elizabeth. Why buy certified seed? At least in New York, seed certification is voluntary. It's an added expense in the production of seed because there are a lot more goes into the production. There's a higher quality standard that may be difficult to meet. So what goes into this blue tag? The certified seed standards follow the Federal Seed Act, at least for New York. One thing you have is limited generation. The developer or owner may limit the number of generations of the classes, and in our case, we're talking about certified seed. This helps keep its genetic purity and identity intact. There are several field standards. For instance, in the inspection process, an inspector will look at a field of certified, let's say the wheat grain that he wants to certify, and check for isolation. If there's other wheat grown, is there a proper distance between the plantings? You don't want to get them mixed. Is there proper rotation maintained? You don't want to be planting wheat on top of rye or something. The weeds, are there any prohibited or restricted weeds? In New York State, we have concerns with wild garlic and wild onion, and the vetches, crown, hairy, and narrow leaf vetch. Also seed standards. After harvest, again, the genetic identity is looked at. Actually, I skipped ahead, I'm sorry. The inspector is also looking through the field at the genetic identity of the crop. So they'll be scouting for off types, and these will be documented, and there'll be a tolerance for that. The genetic purity, if other varieties of wheat are mixed in or other crops, this is all documented. Diseases, there's tolerance for different diseases. Smut and bunt, for instance, there's a tolerance in the different classes of seed. And now we move to the seed standards. Again, with the genetic identity, you're looking at purity. If you're growing soft white winter wheat, you don't want to see too many red kernels in there. And also weed seed. There's a low tolerance for that, but there's some prohibited species. Again, I mentioned the vetches. There's a zero tolerance for that in the seed sample. And there's various inert matter and, of course, germination tests. The bottom two requirements are actually related to potatoes, so I'll skip those. So what does the blue tag mean for the consumer? You see what you get. You get an independent third-party verification. It's proper labeling, and you know you have the correct kind and variety, and the minimum standards are met, and so you can see that all on the label. And it is equivalent regardless of the origin of the seed or the company marketing the seed. So a Minnesota blue tag will be the same, the same guidelines as a New York blue tag. You know what you're getting. And on variety selection, you want to have something that's well adapted to the region. We know in New York we're dealing with issues with moisture and disease, so some disease tolerance package would be in order for like mildew or sprout or fusarium head blight. Sprout resistance is also an issue because of the same moisture problems. You'd want a lodging resistant variety and good quality characteristics. You're looking for milling and baking. Of course, you want everything. You want the perfect variety. One way to help is to check the public records for varietal trials in your region. I list here because we're here presenting today the Cornell and the Penn State varietal trials reports can be found online easily, but as can Ohio and Michigan and Maine and Vermont. You can find all this information very easily. I have here just one of our summer trials. It's of a spring wheat nursery. It's an organic group. What I want to talk about is just the best way to make a variety, trying to make a variety selection. As I said, it should be well adapted to the region. Stoa, for instance, is a hard red spring that we use as a check. It's a North Dakota line that is well adapted for our region. Variety selection should be based not only on yield and quality, but also, in our case, disease resistance. So if we look at entry number 9 in red, Steel is a top leading variety, but Sabin and Glen and Tom also have moderately resistant to Fusarium head blight. And we know from past tests that Glen has excellent milling and baking quality. And so you might be looking at Glen and Sabin as potentially a good choice for our region. These are not recommendations. This is only 1-year data, but this is a thought process that might go into it. So there's some problems in sourcing quality seed. One is public varieties and seed saving. They can be maintained year after year on farms without methods in place for maintaining variety purity. A lot of us do it, and it's sometimes the only way to get some of these old seed lines. But it also ends up a problem with maintaining the identity. The other problem is the scale, mostly in production. These are niche markets, and while they're potentially, some of them are, while they're potentially lucrative, they may not warrant enough for certified seed production. There's potential high cost and low return for some of these heritage varieties. And there's also a much higher cost associated in the production of certified seed on small acreage. Talking with Alan Wester at the New York's Seed Improvement Program, mentioned that when he does some of our varieties, we're doing small acreage under 5 acres. The cost per acre is over $1,000, and this is just in the manpower and cleaning the combines and cleaning the planters and walking through the fields and roguing the plants. So it's high input. Some resources are out there for sourcing quality seed. This Association of Official Seed Certifying Agencies has an excellent website. Below are some of the Northeast members, and I included Ohio too because they also carry wheat, barley, and oats. Through there, you can also find a link to sourcing organic seed, which is very helpful, not just for wheat, but for all organic crops available. Through the New York Seed Improvement Program and a local company, Lakeview Organics, they have some varieties that are actually double certified. So they're certified by the Seed Improvement Program, as well as Know for New York that it is grown organic. So this double certification is nice, but it's hard to find. Albert Lee Seed Company in Minnesota, working with the Minnesota Crop Improvement Association, has double certified Glen, RB07, and Prosper Hard Red Spring Wheat. And talking with somebody at Johnny Selected Seed, I'm not sure of who does their blue tag certification, but Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners have certified, organically certified the Glen Hard Red Spring. So there is some, there are some choices out there. Also, you may be able to obtain untreated conventionally grown certified seed and grow it organically if justifications are met. I don't know the exact rules, but you can talk with your organics organization. And local seed companies or crop improvement associations like NYCRR may do so on request. So there, you may get some opportunities for that. And I think I've well run out of time, and let me pass it over to Greg.
Okay, thank you, David. We're going to now, once you've made a decision about the kind of seed you're going to grow, and we have, as David mentioned, we have options for winter grains and spring grains. Then you need to think about your crop management. And crop management is an important aspect of quality small grain production that we think often gets overlooked. And probably because small grains are generally pretty easy to grow, but it can be difficult to grow them and get quality grain. So paying attention to details of the growing these grains and not treating them just like a cover crop, for example, can pay dividends when you're looking at some of those quality tests at the end that Elizabeth talked about. And particularly, crop management can have an impact on the disease, that fusarium head blight. It can provide additional N for protein development in the grain, and we can help to reduce weed seed in the harvested grain, and also we reduce lodging, which tends to lead to anti-quality traits in the grains as well. And that lodging means that the crop falls over, and then when it's harvested, it can be contaminated with stones and dirt, and might have low test weight as well. So let's take a few minutes and talk a little bit about our crop rotations. I don't know if can I go back one slide? I'm not sure how to do that.
Unmuted.
Can help me on that?
Yeah, you should just be able to press the up arrow and go back. Yeah, there you go.
The up arrow?
Yeah, it just skipped back.
Okay, I see it.
Yeah, sometimes a bit of a delay.
Okay, there we go. So ideally, we want to have crop rotations designed so they play a key role in doing some of these things for us, reducing disease, reducing weeds, and supplying nitrogen to the small grain crop. And farmers over the years have developed rotations that are somewhat effective at doing this. And some examples would be like corn, soybeans, and wheat interseeded with clover. And in this way, the wheat is following a soybean crop. It can get some nitrogen from the soybeans, and the clover that's interseeded with the wheat can provide some nitrogen to the succeeding corn crop. And the wheat's not exposed to fusarium spores that would be in the corn stubble. So that's an example of an effective rotation. And corn, oats, and wheat is another example where the wheat is not following another related small grain. So some other ideal for winter grains, the ideal preceding crops are things like oats, soybeans or dry beans, vegetable crops like green beans, for example, or a sod that has some legume in it like clover and alfalfa. A little less desirable is to follow corn or grass hay, although a fair amount of wheat does get planted following corn. Organic farmers that do this try to bury a lot of the residue with moldboard plowing, and that helps to avoid some of the contamination that can occur from the corn stover onto the succeeding wheat crop. Really undesirable things would be to have winter grains like wheat, barley, or rye preceding a winter wheat crop. One thing that could happen is diseases could be transferred from the stubble of the previous crop to your grain crop, or you may have some contamination, which then would impact grain quality and also cause problems in saving the seed if that's something you're interested in. So thinking about some of those things, if we move to spring grains, it's a little bit different. One of the issues with spring grains we generally notice is that weed control is more difficult. And some of our collaborators in the project have been pretty good about supplying most of the nitrogen from either legume hay fields or sometimes from corn fields that had a lot of manure applied in the previous year. So ideally, one thing that I worry about is going in with my spring grains is going into a field that's not going to have a lot heavy annual weed pressure, something I was able to cultivate or suppress the weeds with clover or alfalfa or other legume cover crops. So those crops, and corn maybe, and potatoes might be good choices. A little less desirable might be soybeans. Some of our soybeans get very weedy, and maybe grass hay. Sometimes it's difficult to kill all those pieces of sod, so it takes a little extra step. And then also any kind of spring wheat, barley, or rye would be undesirable alternative to precede the spring grains. For the next thing we want to talk about is fertility. And this is an area that requires some judgment on everybody's part because every situation is different. But here's some fundamentals, and that's nitrogen is critical for tillering, head development, and this grain protein. So on one hand, we'd like to have a decent amount of nitrogen available. If we get too much nitrogen available, we can cause lodging, so we want to watch that. And rotations with a good legume crop and supplementing with poultry or organic fertilizers when necessary is the usual strategy. We should try to avoid excessive reliance on manures because they can lead to buildups of soil phosphorus after a while. And then we have to adjust the rates based on a rotation. Typically, we've been trying to apply manures in fall or late winter to these small grain crops, and folks have generally had success with 50 to 75 pounds of total N in the fall from a manure. If you're worried about getting enough N on a second application in late winter, say poultry manure or pelletized poultry manure, might be possible. Ideally, you might not need that because we're following the legume crop. Another strategy in some situations, a top dress with an alternative product in the spring might add to the grain protein. This would be something like blood meal. Elizabeth may talk about this more in the question and answer period, about strategically trying to add a little protein late in the season to boost the grain protein. Spelt is a relative of winter wheat, and it's generally less responsive to nitrogen than wheat and tends to be a little bit more lodging susceptible. So probably using N rates that are about 70, provide about 70% of the N we're talking about for wheat is appropriate for some of the taller spelt varieties. For the spring wheats, generally a pre-plant application of manure or some nitrogen from a residual N from legumes is ideal. And if you don't have any, then folks in the Northeast have had some success with about 70 pounds of N as total N in the manure applied pre-plant for spring wheat crops. For heritage wheats, some of the heritage wheats are taller and more prone to lodging. On these, it might be more appropriate to be a little bit more conservative on N than some of the shorter and more modern wheats that you might grow in crop production. So heritage wheats, we're still looking at that as part of our project, but we're thinking that in some cases we might want to be a little more conservative with our N rates than with some of the traditional winter wheats. And as we turn to emmer and einkorn, they're also like the heritage wheats. They're less responsive to N than wheat, and they also are somewhat prone to lodging. Probably if you had a good legume cover crop or a hay field that was plowed down, you're probably going to have enough N to grow a decent emmer crop, and you want to avoid putting on a little too much N that can lead to a lot of lodging. And again, this is one of our project goals, is to look at this aspect of emmer and einkorn management. Also want to pay attention to P and K. Phosphorus can build up with excessive use of poultry manure. Potassium can be rapidly depleted if you harvest hay or straw from the fields like this farmer's going to do in this picture. And trying to keep up with that on soil testing and minimizing the amount of straw and hay removed can avoid some issues that we have in that arena. As terms of field preparation, we'd like to have the till the fields well in advance of planting if possible, and then perform secondary tillage after a couple weeks and immediately prior to planting to kill any emerged weeds. We try to avoid overworking the soils multiple times and destroying the soil structure, because eventually that leads to slow growth and As far as planting date goes, planting date is critical to get good development. If you plant too early, like some of our cover croppers do, you can increase the diseases such as powdery mildew and barley yellow dwarf, which is transmitted by aphids in the fall. Also, another insect called Hessian fly starting to be a problem again in some areas with early planting. So we have something called the Hessian fly free date, and wheat and spelt in the winter. In the fall crop should be planted as soon after the Hessian fly free as possible. In my area here in central Pennsylvania, that's going to be about the 25th of September, and it might be a little bit earlier as we go north and later as we go south. For the spring crops like spring wheat, emmer, and einkorn, you want to try to plant them as soon as feasible in the spring, often late March through mid-April in the area that we're working in here in the Northeast. This helps them develop before temperatures get real hot in midsummer. As far as seeding rates go, for wheat, some good general ranges. There's about 120 to 150 pounds per acre, and that gives us about 1.4 to 1.8 million seeds per acre. As you get later in the fall, you want to boost that up about 10% per week. And then for spring wheats, since they're a little less competitive and have a little bit more weed pressure, we've been generally seeding them in about 2.5 bushels per acre, which is about 150 pounds per acre. And the heritage wheats is another area that we're looking at. Some of these can lodge if you get the seeding rates too high. So one of our collaborators, Mike Davis up at Cornell, did a study. He actually found that a low seeding rate of like 47, 50 pounds per acre was preferable to a higher seeding rate with some of the lodging susceptible varieties. Probably he was planning on time with that in that study, and that's how he was getting away with some of those lower seeding rates. Those were attractive too if the seed cost is high, as it is for some of these. And spelt's pretty flexible in terms of seeding rates. Seeding rates could actually range from 100 to 150 pounds of hulled seed. We have cooperators here that like to seed dehulled seed at about 120 pounds per acre, and they've had good success doing that. And that would translate into about 150 pounds in the hulled form. As far as emmer, which is another hulled crop, our general recommendation is about 100 pounds per acre. But if you have high fertility fields and you have a history of lodging, we feel it might be good to maybe bump that downwards. And in some of our studies, we've had success at the 75 to 50 pound rate with emmer. So getting that right helps to avoid some of the lodging problems. And you can seed some of these ancient grains either in the hulled form or the hullless forms. And there's advocates for both. The hulled seeds actually are a little bit more readily available. Sometimes, surprisingly, they germinate more quickly. You get about 30% fewer actual seeds per pound. And sometimes with high seeding rates, it's hard to get enough seed on in some situations. The hulled seed are easier to meter, and it's easier to estimate the population of seed planted. So both have their attributes. It's a matter of personal preference and
unmuted
to work with. So those are some aspects of management that are critical to avoid diseases, reduce lodging, and try to get some good protein in the grain. Now I'm going to switch it over to one of my colleagues who's going to talk to us a little bit more about weed management and cultural management practices.
Thanks, Greg. It's David here. There's going to be a lot of overlap with what Greg has talked about and what Elizabeth will talk about, so I'll skip over those sections and leave it for them. They do a much better job. But some things to consider in mechanical weed control are the weed species present, soil conditions, crop plant size, equipment, and of course weather. And the goals of mechanical weed seed control are to eliminate the bulk of the weed population before it competes with the crop and to reduce the weed seed that's in the field. So Greg has already talked about crop rotation. There's also site selection. You don't want to inherit problems. If you're starting on some fallow ground and it's loaded with quackgrass, maybe you want to avoid that for the first year or two and have some rotate something else through. Cover crops, Elizabeth will talk about that, but you want to choose them wisely. I know sometimes in organic use, vetch is used. That would be a poor choice, considering it's a noxious weed in the small grains. I've already discussed cultivar selection and using a good quality seed to compete with the weeds, so you get rapid growth and tillering and hopefully crowd out the weeds. Sorry, I'm not getting my...
Okay, hang on a second. I'll get it back for you.
There we go.
Okay.
Greg also covered planting date and seeding rate, and perhaps overseeding with a crop such as clover. Elizabeth will talk some on that. Greatly overlooked, I think, and one of the simplest things is sanitation and field inspection. Bringing equipment in and out of the field, you should at least pre-wash it before entering the fields. Mowers collect a lot of weed seed on top and within. Planters, tillers, plows, anything that hits the soil. I mean, even tires on muddy days, you're bringing stuff into
Muted.
And not only weed, but you might be dealing with some other soil-borne pathogens. So pre-washing your equipment is quite important. Field scouting several times from the growing season is imperative. This way you can address problems with early detection. This would be a good time for roguing. You're walking through the field and you see off types, or you see rye in your wheat. You know, one rye plant can have, you know, hundreds of seeds, and you just pull that out. You're avoiding problems later on. You might have hot spots in the field where this has occurred, but the best way to alert yourself to it is with scouting. The false planting, actually Greg talked about this in the field preparation, so I won't cover what he did, but working the field several times before planting as you're planting will greatly reduce weed pressure later on. I talked about hand roguing. And lastly, tine or harrow weeding or a field cultivator. This can be done anytime from a week to several weeks after planting. There's different methods. We at Cornell, we have access to a small tine weeder. This is about 8-foot width. These come as large as 70 feet, so you can cover quite a bit of ground with them. They work well in getting they don't discriminate. They go right over the plant, so they get between rows and do a fairly good job. It's best if worked in both directions. There is another practice called blind cultivation, and I haven't tried this yet. It's a little nerve-wracking for me, where you go over the field before the crop germinates, and you're just scratching the surface. And then again, about a week or so later, you can pass again, and knocking the weeds down. There's also between row weeding with a cultivator that can also be done, but I wouldn't use this as a sole source. More of a follow-up to tine weeding. Maybe not as practical in wheat, but it would be good in other row crops as well. So I think I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Elizabeth to go over the non-mechanical. Oh.
Do I have control of it now, Alice? Or?
Unmuted. Yes,
Alice?
You do. Yes.
It's advanced too far, so.
Okay, you can go back. Just use the up arrow.
I'm trying, but it's.
Okay, there's a bit of a delay. It should. I'll put it back for you in the meantime.
Well, David did a great job of giving you an overview of organic weed management for grain quality. And I'm just going to touch a little bit harder on a couple of areas here, because I think this is an area where the organic community really needs to do better.
Muted.
I see, and I know growers complain about just weed-choked, especially spring wheat fields. And even some winter wheat fields have a lot of weeds in them. So I just wanted to touch on a few things really quickly, and I may skip some slides because I notice we're rapidly moving out of time. But I wanted to talk about rotation because I agree with Clyde Leidy that it really is the most effective means of keeping organic land free of weeds. And so you really want to devise a crop rotation that differs in plant series of crops that differ in plant family, planting and harvesting dates, growth habit, and planting method. It's not advancing. Let's see, there we go. And one of my favorites, and it's been touched on a little bit by Greg for fertility benefits, is it's a very weed suppressive crop that's 2 or more years of a mowed legume sod crop. You're looking at alfalfa, could be red clover, could be yellow sweet clover. This kills the seeds of a lot of the annual grasses. It's also excellent for control of perennials like Canada thistle. The key is to keep it mowed or hayed. In terms of cover crops, one that I think we're not thinking about enough are some of these midsummer cover crops. Buckwheat is an excellent example. What that allows us to do, especially for those of you that have a ragweed problem, is to be able to do tillage at unconventional times of year. So for example, in the late spring and early summer, in midsummer when you plant the crop, and then in late summer again when you're tilling it down to stop, for example, buckwheat from seeding itself. This allows you to bring up flushes of seed from the weed seed bank and really starts to clean up your fields. You can also use things like sorghum sudan and Japanese millet, but buckwheat is wonderful. You can also think of crop rotation historically in terms of traditional cleaning crops. The great four-course rotations of the 18th century always included a root crop like turnip or swede. We can substitute potatoes in our day and age. These can be very useful for keeping weeds at bay. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about cultivated crops. Greg was talking about a little bit about this in his section on crop rotation. A row crop that is effectively cultivated is a massively good thing for your crop rotation. Of course, the key word is effectively cultivated. What you're looking at here is organic corn and organic soybean that has been carefully tended and brilliantly cultivated. So after this soybean crop, for example, I would have no hesitation in planting a spring wheat. So these are just some examples of things to think about as you're managing your rotation. I wanted to say one more word about interseeding. Interseeding with a forage legume is extraordinarily good for a lot of reasons: nitrogen fixation, organic matter incorporation, but it also can be quite successful in terms of suppressing weeds, particularly in winter grains, but even in spring grains it can have some effect. And so I always advocate that whenever you plant a grain in winter or spring, you interseed it with a forage legume. One last thing in this section, and that is we've been hearing about seeding rates. A classic strategy of organic growers that really does work is to have high-density plantings.
Unmuted.
I often hear from growers that they're seeding at, for example, their wheats at 180 pounds per acre or even higher. That strategy will work. Of course, it's an expensive strategy because you've got to buy more seed and put more seed on. So hopefully we can start reducing our seeding rates as we begin to use some of these other techniques more effectively. Finally, just to touch on what David has been saying, it's really important to choose to fit the crop to the field. If you have a very, very weedy field, it would not be a good idea at all to plant a spring grain. If you have a field that you think may be okay, but you're not sure, a more competitive spring crop like spring emmer would be a better choice. And then, of course, for fields that you're still cleaning up the weeds on, a winter grain is preferable. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David again.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. I think we're on the right page. Talk to a few issues leading up to harvest. Grains in the northeast, you have to be considering fusarium head blight or scab. This infects heads at flowering, which in our is usually late May to early June. Flowering is a few days after heading date. At this time of year, it's still very cool, and the cool evenings tend to drop dew down, and we know that the head blight spores are flowing through the atmosphere, and they'll come and settle down with dew, and your flowering plants are just ripe for infection. Infected head has a bleach spikelets that I think you saw pictures earlier, and evident about 2 to 3 weeks after flowering. Scouting at this time is imperative, as scab is not as evident in mature harvestable heads. Elizabeth already talked about deoxynivalenol, vomitoxin detected in infected kernels. The limit is 1 part per million at the mill. Oh, I did it again, I'm sorry. So if you haven't seen, over here to the left, you see a fully infected head. the bleaching effect, it stands out quite in the field. Over here, it's just a few spikelets, but if you go out into the field, you'll be able to see this very easily, and it would give you opportunity to do some management. In particular, perhaps you could avoid harvesting areas of high infection. Areas by hedgerows, windbreaks, or low areas might be regions of higher moisture and hence more conducive to infection. So scouting would alert you to these problem areas. Also, as Elizabeth mentioned, infected kernels tend to be smaller. Raising the fan speed on your combine or on your cleaning equipment can help blow out these smaller kernels. And we talked about it before, and like to hammer home the idea of investigating resistant varieties. As part of our conventional program, we work with the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, and they have a wonderful website where you can look at disease forecasting, you can look at varietal trial results, and you can also look at some of the resistant varieties that come out of different programs. So there's a lot of good information there. Another issue at harvest time is pre-harvest sprouting. Germination of the grain occurs in the spike just prior to harvest, and a period of prolonged rainfall and or high humidity can cause PHS, and it can be an overnight effect, and this will ruin the grain quality for any milling and baking purposes. So there's a few things you can do to help, and again it involves scouting. We go out and test everything in our program, everything that comes through, including the organic grains we're doing now. And then we get an idea of the sprouting. We try to release varieties with just a little better sprouting resistance than the previous lines. And if you've seen it in the field, hopefully you don't see anything like this. This is sprouting on a 0 to 9 scale, but pretty much anything over 0 or 1 is unacceptable for any sort of grain quality. So when you're out in the field, you're getting towards harvest, maybe you can scout the field and check for moisture. There are handheld moisture meters, or maybe you could cut some and thresh it and bring it back and check.
Unmuted.
Maybe you could harvest at higher moisture if grain dryers are an option, if you know bad weather is coming. And while you have some of the threshed grain, you could look for unusually low test weight or falling numbers. And again, investigating sprout-resistant varieties. Red wheats tend to be more sprout-resistant than whites, but there are some tolerant varieties, both in soft whites, hard whites, and reds. So again, variety selection and scouting are key. So I think I'm done with my section, and I'll pass it back to Elizabeth to take it home.
Well, yes, and so we're going to talk about a whole bunch of things in very little time, but these are very critical issues in terms of maintaining seed quality. So let's start out with some seed cleaning management, and the thing here is start thinking about it before you really think you should start thinking about it, because I've seen many a wonderful lot of grain be contaminated because the combine wasn't cleaned out. Other times to think about this is immediately after harvest, before testing and sale, and before storage. Now, you might not, trying to advance the slide, but it doesn't seem to be working. You might not, here we go. So immediately after harvest, whoops, this is very important, especially for organic growers, because very often we're combining weedy fields where there's coarse green matter. Sometimes we have a legume underseed, and that's also getting into the combine with the seed. And there are often lots of green weed seeds. Muted. This material is allowed to stay in the grain even for 24 hours. You can have grain spoilage because the moisture is transferred from the green material to the seed, and as bad, you can get off flavors, which make it unsaleable. So having a double screen rotary cleaner is an excellent idea on your farm. You're probably more familiar with air screen cleaners. You should clean with an air screen cleaner before you send in your sample for grain quality testing, and of course before sale. These will remove chaff, weed seeds, and other contaminants, and they come in all shapes and sizes and all price ranges, fortunately. From the little clipper up here, which is the only new one on this slide, to one that's very much like mine. This is a 2-screen cleaner. Mine cost me $200 and $50 to repair it. It works just fine. To these other larger models, this is the model used by Tor Oshner on his farm and one by Rodney Graham. These older models can work just fine if you maintain them properly, or there are some newer models. But this is really critical for any scale grower to have an air screen cleaner. You may find in some years and in some fields that you need more cleaning before sale. For example, if you have a problem with stones, oats, or wild radish in your wheat seed, you may need to put them through across a gravity table separator. That separates by density or specific gravity and can do an excellent job. An indent separator is another machine that's very useful that separates on the basis of seed length and allows you to separate, for example, vetch from grain, which is very important because vetch can cause off flavor in milling quality grain. A really great, wonderful thing that comes straight from you free from the National Agricultural Library is a wonderful pamphlet called Mechanical Seed Cleaning and Handling. It's free online. Read it. It's wonderful on seed cleaning. I'm going to turn now to dehulling, because this is also important. If you're going to sell spelt, emmer, and einkorn, you've got to get them dehulled. This can be quite an issue. Fortunately for us, those that are growing larger quantities of these grain, there are dehulling facilities in both New York and Pennsylvania that I know of, and I think some in Ohio as well, where you can have your ancient grain dehulled. For smaller scale growers, this is not an option, and so what we're working on very hard now is to find options for small scale dehulling, either by individual growers buying a smaller scale dehuller or by sharing one. There are a couple of U.S. companies, but we're really looking right now at European companies that have what we call universal dehullers that can dehull all three. If you're interested in this, if you've bought one of these, please get in touch with me, because we're very anxious to work on this together with growers. Whatever you decide to do, you have to factor in the cost of either the custom dehulling or buying the machine, the power requirements of the machine, its effectiveness in terms of dehulling cracked kernels, and then of course how you're going to separate hulls from kernels and the dehulled grain from the hulled grain. Interestingly, I just ran across a dehulling site that's great. It's in Swedish, but it does a terrific job of walking you through some of the options, and you can translate it on the Google Translate bar. So I recommend that website. Moving on to grain drying, extremely important for grain quality. Very often we're bringing our wheat off the field well above 13% moisture. We've got to get it to 13% moisture or below for long-term storage. In the case of larger scale farms, it may be prudent to have a grain dryer in addition to clean bins with drying floors and fans. On a smaller scale, you have a number of options to do the same job. You see Tor Oshner here with his screw-in aerator. It's missing the fan on top, but it's very simple. Just plug it into a tote filled with grain or a gravity wagon, and it can dry by air circulation. Here's Rodney Graham with another jury-rigged air circulation idea, an axial fan. He's he's fitted his gravity wagon so that he can mount this axial fan, and then that can circulate air through the stored grain. And do not be ashamed if you're smaller scale and you don't have any of this. You can always spread your grain out onto a clean surface and periodically turn it. It will work, but you've got to get the grain dry. I think we're going on into small-scale storage. People often ask me for ideas on small-scale storage. Probably the most popular thing are these ton or half-ton plastic totes. You can design your own. Here, R.G. Bell has made some very nice wooden grain bins. They work just fine. He also purchased some food-grade plastic containers. You see it here receiving seed from a cleaner. They come with tight-fitting snap-on lids, and it makes an excellent, excellent small-scale storage container. I'm just going to spend 1 minute, even though we're out of time, because more and more I'm hearing problems, and our team is hearing problems in terms of insect control and storage. There are two insects that are bothering people: the Indian meal moth and the granary weevil. Both of these, the larval stages, can do a lot of damage. You usually can see the Indian meal moth because the larval stage produces cobwebby strings that you can see on the grain. The granary weevil is much more difficult to detect because the female actually bores through the kernel, lays eggs inside, and the larva develops in there and eventually eats its way from inside to out. All you usually see is a hole in the grain where the adult escaped. There are means of controlling these two insects. Sanitation is your first port of call. Make sure that you clean out all your bins. Anywhere where grain is temporarily stored, where it passes through augers, truck beds, those need to be kept nice and clean. Bags of grain should not be sitting around. Old bags of grain, they often harbor these things. Pheromone lures and sticky traps are excellent for monitoring India meal moth. Diatomaceous earth is a big, big friend to people in this regard. Diatomaceous earth feels to us just like mildly abrasive, but to soft-bodied insects, it'll cut them to pieces. And more importantly, the adult weevil is also badly affected by diatomaceous earth. So both of these insect pests can be controlled with diatomaceous earth, which you actually mix in small amounts into your grain. I'd be happy to talk about more specifics on this in the question period. I'm going to bypass heat rather quickly because although it's sort of a system of last resort, heat will kill insects, but it will also cause the grain quality to be affected adversely, usually through over drying of the grain. Much more interesting for us are cold or freezing. Both these insects at below 59 degrees, the granary weevil becomes inactive. Below 50 degrees, the India meal moth similarly is affected. So storing in cool temperatures or under refrigeration, if it's an option, excellent. Freezing, even better. It'll kill these babies. You might have to go through several freezing and thawing cycles, as we do in our winters, because during the thawing cycles, any eggs or pupa will hatch or emerge, and then they'll be killed in the next freezing cycle. And then very quickly, I've been learning more and more about this. CO2 or N2 might be something that we should be experimenting with. Apparently, organic wheat growers in Australia are using CO2 to control weevils. In sealed bins, they inject CO2 until they have an atmospheric concentration of 60% or more of CO2. Leave that for 2 weeks, kills all the insects. Apparently the same thing can be done with N2, and think about it, it can be used in any size container as long as you can seal it. So that's something to think about. I'm going to just be very quick here. Rodent control, I've seen a couple of grain lots be unsaleable for milling quality because rats were not only eating the grain, but they were pooping in it and they were peeing in it. So this is a big thing. Sanitation is a big part here. Do not have spilled grain or dusty, cluttered areas. This is R.G. Bell's grain storage area that he had built, and look at it inside. It's just meticulously clean. That's the way all of ours should be, mine included, and it isn't always. Cats will drive the rats away, probably to your neighbors. Rat proofing with metal strips or wire mesh over windows. Here I've gone one step further to try to preserve all these rare accessions of emmer, spelt, and einkorn I have, so I've lined my grain storage room with metal roofing sheeting. So I'd like to just summarize what we've been talking about, and we can go quickly into questions. In terms of common grain quality issues for low protein in bread wheat, choose the appropriate variety, have adequate but not excessive fertilization and good weed management to avoid competition for N. Avoid bytaste from weed contamination in grain by sound weed management, roguing, and using that rotary cleaner. Stone in grade, avoid lodging due to excessive N fertilization and proper combining. Moldy grain, again, that rotary cleaner is great, storage at 13% moisture or less. Sprouting in the head and low falling number, timely harvest and appropriate variety. Insect damage in storage, good sanitation and storage conditions, diatomaceous earth, and a couple of the other things we talked about. And diseased seed, fusarium infection with vomitox. Unmuted. Appropriate variety, sound rotation, scouting, avoiding harvesting areas of high infection, seed cleaning. Use seed cleaning to get rid of some of the diseased kernels, and finding an appropriate market in the event that you're over that 1 part per million threshold. So, last thing, but very, very important, we have many people to thank for the information we provided here. Here are as many as we could remember, but I think at this point I'll hand it over to Alice for questions.
Let's move on to the questions. Let's see. You were talking about cover crops and legume cover crops, and there's a question here about how lentils would work as a cover crop. Does anyone have any experience with that? In
a wheat crop?
Yes.
Yeah, in the Northeast, they might not grow particularly well. I could see them working perhaps in a warmer, drier area. Also, yeah, if they mean as an interseeded crop, are they talking about as a cover crop?
I'm not sure. It says a
Yeah.
cover crop in the question. Yeah.
Yeah, as a cover crop, lentils would not be a particularly weed suppressive crop in our region in the Northeast because they're not going to grow fast enough and be suppressive enough quickly enough in the season.
Okay.
But they could work in other areas.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple questions about certified seed. One person wanted to know how they could find the seed certification requirements in their state, which you hadn't mentioned. They're in Pennsylvania. Is that the Organization of Seed Certifying Agencies, is that a place to find seed certification information for all states? Can someone comment on that?
There is, it's not all states. All states who are members.
Okay.
So we'd have to run through the website and find that out. Also, Greg may know of organization in Pennsylvania, yeah, you can find quite a lot of information on that website.
Yeah, I found some information on the Department of Ag website as well for Pennsylvania.
Yes, I would contact the Pennsylvania Department of Ag. They have a seed testing lab, and they work with all the small grain seed providers and help them with their certification process. That's where I would start to call the Department of Ag here in PA.
Okay. And another question is, what if you're planting a seed blend or mixture? How would that work with a certified seed program?
That's a tough one, and this is a problem with some of the what we'd be dealing with some of these land races, like red fife and some of these old heritage grains. They've been around. They're a variety name, but they're not really a pure variety, and you have to one of the problems with, or not a problem, but one of the when you're doing certified seed, you have to maintain this purity. And so that is a problem. So I don't know how that would work with seed certification.
Okay.
I think in forage crops it's common to have blends of different varieties or species, and I believe they're certified based on the germination and the weed content and characteristics like that, as long as the specific varieties and components are specified on the label. I'm not completely sure about that, but I'm pretty sure they figured a way around that issue of blends of 2 or 3 different varieties, at least in a mixture.
Okay. Here's a question about the buildup of phosphorus in the soil with manures. The question is, isn't this available phosphorus? And since we're approaching peak phosphorus, isn't it to our advantage to maximize available phosphorus as long as we manage it properly and it doesn't run off?
This is Greg, and I would say yes. Generally, that's a good strategy. The problem is, if you do it too often, you'll go beyond what's considered environmentally friendly. So at some point, I think the level is like 200 parts per million phosphorus, and then you create an issue if you do have runoff from the field, and it's been the focus of a lot of nutrient management legislation and concerns. So rather than try to get to that level, I would avoid excessively using poultry manure and getting to that level, and maybe 10 years of poultry manure for corn production might get you to that level. So it's a good practice, but you just don't want to get too carried away with it. And if you're monitoring your soil phosphorus levels and having some conservation practices and minimizing runoff, it can be very valuable. So I agree with some caution, I would say.
Okay, here's a question about whether any of you have tried Fukuoka's method of combining rice and spring wheat. He used barley and rice, but the questioner was wondering if rice and wheat had been tried.
I have no experience with that.
That's a very interesting. That's very interesting because I think more and more of us in this region are interested in growing dryland or upland rice. So I have not tried that, but that would be something that would be a neat project.
Okay. Do you recommend? Here's a couple of questions about weeding here. Do you recommend rotary hoes for mechanical weeding? When, if yes?
I have not tried them. A lot about the weeding is what you have available, and we had tine weeders available. Rotary hoes, I know are also a good option, and I think I would do the same timing. But there's we do it primarily on the spring wheats. I've also done it on the winter wheats, and I know talking with Mike Davis in Worldsboro, who does our North Country trials for the project. He doesn't do mechanical weeding of the winter grains. He says he gets enough with his cover crop and with the planting bed, and it's a little too hard come springtime to work that ground. But I would say just use the same timing on the rotary hoe as the tine weeding.
Okay, and speaking of which, we have a tine weeding question. When tine harrowing spring wheat or barley post-seeding, what is the level of damage to seedlings? Is it significant, and what are the parameters for seedling damage? The tension on the tine or the cross harrowing?
That's why with that blind, I'm afraid myself to do the blind cultivation. I know there's information on it somewhere. But yeah, ideally you're planted deep enough that you're just scratching the surface, so you're not reaching the roots. But yeah, I guess it's just fine-tune adjustment of your cultivator, your tine weeder.
Yeah, I think that
I don't know if anybody has experience.
I think Heather Darby has just recently put some things on the web about some experiments in their project looking at timing of tine weeding, and one of the things they've been measuring is damage to the crop. Generally speaking, you do get some damage to the crop. And so one thing to do is that's another reason to plant more heavily. I know we tried a tine weeding trial on the Oshner farm with emmer, and it turned out that tine weeding, at least in that season in emmer, was a very bad idea. We actually reduced our yield significantly when we tine weeded without controlling the weeds much, and we suspected it, well, we knew it was because we were damaging the stand. So you need to be careful, but I would recommend looking up her. I just managed to didn't get even a chance to read it, but it's on the web. If you need that citation, just let me know and I'll send it to you.
Okay. Does an interseeded legume produce nitrogen for the wheat, or does it just block weeds?
Generally speaking, there have been some studies that have shown some transfer during the season in a hay crop or something like that. But generally speaking, the nitrogen that you're getting from an interseeded legume in a small grain is going to be available to the following crops.
Yes.
Okay, here's a question from a self-described organic novice. Is there an organic seed treatment available for treating the seed prior to planting with seedling vitality and disease resistance in view?
Yeah, well, that was the scope of the SARE project, I think, or part of it, but there is, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, not much available, but I think vinegar has been used, and but I know there's a lot of seed treatments available in Europe, but not much available here. Do you have anything to say on that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm very conservative on that. I think that one of the things we get ourselves into in the organic community is sometimes trying for substitutive things, trying to mimic what the conventional growers are doing. I think if you're planting in a timely fashion in the correct soil and you've done your field prep right, I think you can do without any seed treatment. That's just my opinion.
Okay. Let's see, two questions about diatomaceous earth. The first one is, what would be the application rate of diatomaceous earth? And the second is it a quality factor for milling or malting quality of grain for the millers or baker or maltster?
Yeah, that's a good question. Both questions are very good. Actually, most of the growers that I know that are using diatomaceous earth, they're using a very small rate. So, for example, I've heard as low as a quarter pound for a ton of grain, or 2 pounds for a ton of grain. And then some growers are really pouring it in. When you're filling a bin with grain, usually it's a good idea to thoroughly dust the bottom of the bin with it, and then add it in small portions as the bin is filling. And then most growers put a lot more at the top, where a lot of the Indian meal moth activity is taking place. But generally speaking, most growers are using a very small amount. About the quality issue, yes, it is a quality issue. You know, you're using food grade diatomaceous earth, so that's not the issue. But if you have a lot in there, it can actually apparently cause constipation, and it can have some quality parameters. So unless you're using a very small amount, I think most growers need to clean the diatomaceous earth off using seed cleaners, so that there's not a lot of surplus in there when it goes to the buyer.
Okay, we've had a couple questions now about lodging, and if you could just first quickly say, what is lodging?
Oh, that's the standability of the crop, its ability to stay standing. And so a lot of factors affect lodging. Sometimes it's genetic. Sometimes, as Greg said, it's planting density. If you plant some of these older grains too dense, they have the tendency to fall over. And as you can understand, lodging is a big problem if you want to get any sort of wheat quality, because you don't want your heads laying on the ground. So there's different grades of lodging, and we, Greg and ourselves, we score them on a scale, and there is quite a lot of resistant varieties. Of course, these are the more modern, shorter stature varieties. But yeah, lodging can be a big problem, affected by fertility and planting density. And genetics. There's more factors in there too. Some disease can cause it. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Greg.
Oh, I'd just say the other one would be a midsummer thunderstorms right before harvest. We cringe about.
Sounds like you've had some experience with that. Okay, another lodging question. Regarding lodging, I assume you may be planting densely for weed control in organic systems. Is there a balance that may be struck between lower populations and good tillering with good fertility versus lower fertility and higher populations that may get leggy and lodge?
Yeah, that was an issue that we discussed, because when we were doing our trials, we had to keep things consistent. So we grew everything at a 2 bushel per acre rate, but you may want to adjust that on a per variety basis. So yeah, because there were we had some conflicting reports here on weed control versus planting density. Yeah, you should play that by the variety, I guess.
Also, in terms of ancient grains, we are seeing quite a bit of tillering with a lot of the emmer varieties and some of the einkorn varieties we've been observing. So on those grains, I think again you can count on a strong tillering ability rather than planting at a high density.
Okay, thanks. There's another comment on lentils. It's not overly weed suppressive. Let's see, it does break down quickly as a green manure, but moist environments make it considerably susceptible. Let's see, I don't know if I can pronounce it, to Ascochyta blight. Maybe it's possible, but risky in the Northeast. So we'll go a few more minutes just because the presentation ran a little bit longer, so we'll keep asking a few more questions here. Oh, that's okay. It was very interesting, so it was worth it. But we'll just ask we'll let the question and answer question go a little longer because we have a lot more questions. Here's a question. I thought that certified seed production could not be certified organic. Is it regional to be certified as organic? Could you just sort of clarify that a little bit?
No, maybe it depends by state. but they're two different certifications. The blue tag certification is addressing the quality of the seed, and that is regardless of how it is grown, whether it's conventional or organic. The organic certification, it might be done by the same agency. In the case of New York, it's done by NIFA, and they're certifying just to see that the crop is grown under organic practices, consistent with their guidelines.
I think
so
one of the problems.
It's just a. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think you pointed out, and it can be said again, that unfortunately it's a bit of a rarity, and we actually have a project that's just starting up that's going to try in the Northeast anyway to make it a lot easier to find what we call double certified seed.
Okay. Let's see. What about using white clover as a cover crop, and would that help with the nitrogen fixation?
Sure. I'd be careful if you're talking about it as a short-term cover crop. You know, you have perennial and annual white clovers, so I'd stick with an annual for a cover crop. But yeah, it's a great end fixer as long as it has enough time in the soil.
Okay. A couple of questions about which forage legumes and which other cover crops you might recommend. Well, I guess this two separate questions. Which forage legumes would you recommend for interseeding?
Oh, what a question! Wow, there's so many wonderful possibilities. So obvious ones and standard ones are red clover, alfalfa, sweet clover, berseem clover is a wonderful interseeded forage legume. So I don't know where that's coming from, but there are many possibilities. You can get more ideas in the great Managing Cover Crops Profitably book. If you want some more suggestions, I'd be happy to give you some. Of course, what you're looking for is something that's going to give you good value in terms of how much the seed costs. So unfortunately, some of the ones like berseem clover are not as readily available. I'm hoping that that's going to change, but there are many possibilities.
Elizabeth, could you just say the best way for people who would be interested to get in touch with you? Because you've mentioned that a few times, and we have a couple questions.
They can just go to the OGRIN website. That's at www.ogrin.org, and you'll find a comment section there, and there also my email is plastered throughout.
Okay, that's great. Let's see, we have time for maybe 2 more questions or so. So the next one would be, what type of annual cover crop would you recommend for small seed grain crops such as emmer, spelt, and einkorn for nutrition and weed suppression?
Preceding cover crops? Well, you know, any kind of red clover combination. So, for example, you could have an oat pea cover crop preceding one of those crops. That should work well. Again, anything with a red clover crop, that'll be one of the cheapest possibilities. So.
Okay. Let's see. Somebody wanted to know whether soil lacking in boron could be a cause of lodging. Have you heard of that?
Go ahead, Greg. I'm not so sure.
I guess I haven't heard of that in small grain production, at least in the Northeast region where we tend to work.
I've heard a couple of growers mentioning boron, and that could be something we could get you more information on.
Okay, we're on to thank everyone for your questions, and mention once again that you can find this presentation in the next few days, and along with our many other recorded presentations on organic farming topics at the link on your screen. You're also welcome to use our Ask an Expert service with other general organic farming questions, and you can find the slides as a PDF handout with all the resources that were mentioned during the webinar right now on the link on your screen. So I'd like to thank you once again, Greg, David, and Elizabeth, for giving this presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.